Introduction. Securing a cannabis license is like winning the lottery. After years of persistence, mountains of paperwork, and countless challenges, you're finally able to open your store and the money pours in. You think all your hard work has paid off and you can finally relax and reap the rewards. Everything is great. For a couple of years. Then more stores open in your area. All of a sudden, you have competition. With more choice, your customers begin spending their money elsewhere. At first, you might not realize you have a problem. Just a slow week, you think. Then a slow week turns into a slow month, and a slow month turns into a slow year. Your revenue stagnates and may even begin to decline. You slowly fall further and further behind your competitors. You know something needs to change, but you have no idea where to start. You feel completely lost, frustrated, and overwhelmed. I've seen this same story play out again and again. Because our industry is so new, it can be easy for cannabis retailers to be tricked into complacency. In the early years after a state legalizes cannabis, either medically or recreationally, the product practically sells itself. Supply is limited and demand is high. You don't have to be an exceptional retailer to make money. You simply need product on the shelves. Many retailers thus experience accidental success and are profitable not because of their actions or business strategy, but simply because of the nature of the market. Looking forward 5, 10, 15 years, the cannabis landscape will be very different. More states will have legalized medical and recreational use, existing markets will have matured, and cannabis may even be legalized on a federal level. We are not far from a future in which we have as many cannabis stores as we do liquor or grocery stores. As soon as more retailers enter the space, you will no longer be able to rely on accidental success. Simply existing will not be enough to compete. You will need to create a better customer experience. The customer experience can always be improved, and every store, no matter how successful, can benefit from being more intentional about their customer experience. However, if any of the following statements apply to you, improving your customer experience might be more than beneficial. It might be necessary to your business's survival. Your revenue is stagnating or declining. You're getting poor customer reviews online. You're struggling to compete with other stores in your area. You attract only a narrow type of customer, for example, men in their 20s. You have difficulty retaining customers. You've never thought about or taken conscious action to improve your customer experience. You're in the process of scaling. You opened your store without having prior retail experience. Wherever you are in your journey as a retailer and whatever specific problems you're facing, the long-term health of your business depends on your customer experience. Creating a better customer experience always starts with understanding your customer, and in our market, understanding the customer means understanding the stigma of cannabis. Why we need to break the stigma of cannabis. Although public support of cannabis is increasing, the simple fact is that a stigma remains. For decades, we've been told as a society that cannabis is dangerous, that it turns people into lazy stoners and dirty hippies and leads to harder drugs. That kind of deeply ingrained programming is difficult to undo, and it has led to a fear of cannabis. Parents worry their kids will be corrupted. Politicians fear the cannabis industry will attract criminals and other trash to their community. And cannabis users are afraid of being judged or punished for their usage. You and I know that cannabis is safe for most people in most circumstances, and we also know that the cannabis industry has many positive economic, medical, and societal benefits. We must recognize, though, that many of our customers struggle with fear and shame due to the stigma. I've worked in the cannabis industry for years, and even I occasionally feel this fear and shame. When I first left the Fortune 500 corporate world, I was embarrassed to tell my former colleagues what I was doing, afraid they would look down on me. Sometimes still today, I get nervous walking into a dispensary, even though I know I shouldn't. I coach my daughter on what to tell people I do for work, because I know that some people won't react well. If you, too, have ever felt nervous or like you had to hide your career in certain situations, then you've experienced the stigma firsthand. And we're professionals. Imagine what it's like for your customers, especially novice or first-time users. The stigma of cannabis is one of the biggest barriers we face as retailers. It's at least partly why cannabis is still federally illegal and listed as a Schedule I drug, which has created incredible logistical challenges for us. It's why some communities are unwelcoming to dispensaries. It's why many people are too afraid to use cannabis, even if they'd benefit from it. It's why cannabis users are judged as lazy or even criminals and discriminated against through the use of employer drug tests. As retailers, we are the face of the cannabis industry. We are the ones with the power to change how people think and feel about cannabis. It will be an uphill battle. Because of the existing prejudices, stereotypes, and biases, our bar is set higher than it is in other industries. To break the stigma, we can't just be good retailers. We have to be great. We have to work harder, be better, and hold ourselves to a higher standard. It might not be fair, but it's the reality, and it's our responsibility as industry professionals. I won't pretend like it's easy, but the rewards are worth it. In breaking the stigma, we can broaden our customer base and connect with our customers in a way that inspires loyalty. We can also hopefully encourage better, more just legislation of cannabis, which will make our jobs easier and protect our customers from discrimination. Bottom line, breaking the stigma is good for business, and it's just the right thing to do. The customer experience is key. The way we break the stigma is through the customer experience. The retail experience we create must overcome the stereotypes. If we can create a delightful experience, one that dispels customers' fears and makes them feel comfortable, we will not only increase customer loyalty and revenue, but we will establish cannabis as a legitimate industry. My goal with this book is to help you create the kind of customer experience that will defy the stigma. A place so welcoming and inclusive that even your grandma would feel comfortable shopping there. One of the things I love best about the cannabis industry is that it is filled with entrepreneurs and small business owners. These people tend to have a lot of passion and hustle, but they don't necessarily come in with a background in retail, which can put them at a disadvantage. You can know everything there is to know about cannabis, but if you don't also understand fundamental retail principles, your store will struggle. You will unconsciously do things that make some customers feel excluded or that create a poor customer experience. That's where I come in. I have a master's in supply chain management from Michigan State University and more than 12 years of experience working for Fortune 500 companies in the retail space, including Whirlpool and Office Depot. During that time, I served in leadership roles, helped navigate major mergers, Whirlpool and Maytag and Office Depot and Office Max, and oversaw initiatives related to inventory, process improvement, systems enhancement, and omnichannel functions. I left the corporate world to found Cannabis Business Growth, a cannabis consulting company where I currently serve as CEO. I have since consulted on more than 300 cannabis projects across the United States, Canada, Puerto Rico, Africa, and Australia, providing expertise and assistance in compliance, licensing, and business strategy. I've now been working exclusively in the cannabis industry for more than 5 years. Basically, what all that means is I understand retail, and I've learned how to translate traditional retail practices to the cannabis industry. The cannabis industry is so new that we don't have much collective knowledge to draw on yet. But the traditional retail industry has been refining best practices for decades. In this book, I share those lessons so that you can become a more effective retailer, which will help you break the stigma and create intentional instead of accidental success. Why I wrote this book. I have a confession I want to get out of the way early. I do not smoke, vape, or consume cannabis. Aside from the occasional THC bath bomb, I don't use cannabis in any way. Why, as a non-user, have I chosen to dedicate my time and energy to cannabis and even write a book about it? It's because of my brother, Joe. Joe's story starts innocuously enough, with a headache during a bowling trip with our stepdad, John. Throughout the book, some names and identifying details have been changed to protect the privacy of the people involved. The only pain medication John had with him was what he had been prescribed as a cancer patient, OxyContin. This was around 2000, before we knew all we do now about OxyContin. John was told it was safe and non-addictive. He'd been sent home with a giant 120-pill bottle, as if it were ibuprofen or any other over-the-counter pain medication. So when Joe said his head hurt, John broke an OxyContin in half and handed it to him. His child was in pain, and he did what many parents would do. He gave Joe a medicine he thought was safe and that was readily available, in an excess supply, in our home. Joe was only 14 years old. Neither he nor my stepdad knew it at the time, but that tiny half pill would trigger a 20-year struggle with addiction for my brother. As an adult and parent of a 13-year-old daughter, I'm mortified that this is how his addiction began. Given the knowledge of opioids at the time, though, and the lies that were presented to doctors by Purdue Pharma, the makers of OxyContin, and the FDA, my stepdad couldn't have known how bad that simple act was. He was just trying to make his kid's headache go away. As parents, all of us must make decisions regarding what medicine to provide our children with the information available to us. It wasn't just my brother who got addicted. There were enough oxys in the house to addict multiple family members and loved ones around John. Before cancer, before opioids, John was a stand-up guy. The opioids turned him into a pretty crappy person who made what I thought were really terrible parenting decisions. In part due to this, I ultimately moved out and sought emancipation at 15 years old. After I left, my brothers told me dozens of horror stories about his behavior. The opioids weren't solely to blame, but they certainly amplified his negative traits and made living with him miserable. John eventually beat cancer, but he never beat his addiction. He died of an opioid overdose just a few years after his cancer went into remission. I often wonder how things would have been different if it weren't for those pills. What if medical cannabis was socially acceptable and legal back then? What if there wasn't a stigma against cannabis, creating shame and fear? What if my stepdad had been offered medical cannabis instead of oxys to manage his pain during his cancer treatment? Maybe my brother wouldn't have had 20 years of his life stolen from him. Maybe my stepdad and hundreds of thousands like him would still be alive. In my heart, I know the trajectories of their lives would have been drastically different if only John had been given cannabis instead of opioids. I don't ever want someone else to suffer the way my family has, and that's why I'm so passionate about cannabis. The ugly reality of the stigma against cannabis. Unfortunately, the what-ifs don't matter. The reality is that because of the stigma of cannabis, my stepdad was never offered medical cannabis, and my brother's life was changed completely and for the worse. At 14, Joe was arrested for selling oxy at school. While this sounds horrid and it is easy to start the cycle of shaming the addict, let me give you some context. Growing up, we didn't have enough money for basics like lunch money. Later in life, Joe told me how hungry he was all the time. So with hundreds of oxys in the house, I can hear the voice in his head. Who will know if you go missing? What's the harm? The doctor would just give John more. The spigot of oxys was never ending. Remember also that Joe was a child. He didn't understand what he was doing. He had been given his first oxy by a trusted source, his stepdad, who had gotten his oxys from a trusted source as well, a doctor. To Joe, it was just medicine, and selling it was a way to fill his belly. At 18, he came to me for the first time with shame, telling me he wanted to clean up his life and have a new beginning. I was 22 at the time and living in Michigan, and he was in Florida. For him to have any chance of getting clean, he needed to be in a place where drugs were not as accessible. So I bought him an airline ticket to Michigan. I helped him get a job and let him live with me. Still being rather naive, I didn't know a ton about recovery. I didn't know enough to push him to attend meetings or get a sponsor. I just gave him a chance with a change of scenery. I thought I would put him under my wing and he would be okay. I couldn't have predicted what would come next. About 3 weeks into him living with me, I got a call around 6:20 in the morning. It was our grandmother. He's gone, Char, she told me. Our dad had passed away. It was a huge blow to both me and Joe. One of the worst things I've ever had to do in my life was look him in the eyes and tell him Dad was gone. We sat in silence together for days, trying to figure out how to put one foot in front of the other. Together, we called our other brother and were responsible for telling the rest of the family. We cried together and mourned. At 18 and 22, we were still just kids, trying to figure out an outlet for that pain. Just a few weeks later, I found out Joe was shooting up heroin. I had no idea what to do. How do you handle that, especially when you're barely an adult yourself? I took him shopping to confront him about it because I knew he wouldn't react badly if we were in public. Standing there in the middle of the mall, I asked him, "You shooting up, man?" He immediately went into lies, denial, and shame, but I knew. "Let me see your arms then," I said, and he refused. That was all the answer I needed. I took him home, and he spent the next few days withdrawing on my couch. I can still picture that couch clearly in my mind, pale pink-orange with a pattern of tiny white flowers, my brother's body laid out on it. If you're lucky, you've never seen somebody withdraw. It's intense and painful. For 3 or 4 solid days, he writhed in pain, sweating through his clothes and had micro-seizures. His body shook and itched unbearably, but he endured. After, I sat him down for some tough love. "I still love you," I told him. "I'm never going to stop loving you. Shit happens. Come on, let's pick up the pieces." That's what we did. And for a few years, he did so well. He stayed with me for a few more months, then moved to North Carolina to live with our uncle, who taught him to do AV work for live events. He loved his job and even got to meet Bill Clinton and Steven Tyler from Aerosmith because of it. He went back to school and was halfway to earning his bachelor's degree. Eventually, though, opioids came back into his life. I don't know for certain how it happened, but I know he broke his hand and foot, and I have a feeling he was prescribed opioids for pain management. Once again, I can't help but think, what if he had been offered cannabis instead? He tried so hard to stay clean, so many times. But he was stuck in the cycle of addiction, a cycle that had started at just 14 years old. Before he had a chance to grow up, his future and what should have been some of the best years of his life were stolen from him. This is the consequence of the stigma of cannabis. And my brother's story isn't unique. In 2017, an estimated 1.7 million people in the United States suffered from substance use disorders related to prescription opioid pain relievers. Breaking all the stigmas. This is a book about cannabis. Yet, in writing it, I quickly discovered that I could not write about the stigma of cannabis without also writing about other stigmas that intersect and connect with cannabis, specifically the stigmas around addiction and race. There's a stigma that addicts are bad people who have made decisions that destroyed their life. As a family member of an addict, I can understand the inclination to think that, even as I know it's not true. Loving an addict is an emotional roller coaster. You don't know what's wrong, then you find out it's drugs, so you try to get them help. Sometimes they resist, sometimes they try. They pick up the pieces only to fall off the wagon again. It feels like a never-ending cycle with no clear path out. You have to straddle the line of wanting to help while still holding the addict accountable. You have to endure the hurt of seeing your loved one act like someone else, someone mean and selfish, who says and does hurtful things. They may steal from you and burn all their bridges. As difficult as it can be as a family member to love an addict and see past their addiction, I think it's even more difficult for the addict. For 20 years, my brother struggled with feelings of shame and worthlessness. He believed the stigma. He believed that he was a bad person, that his addiction was his fault, and that he didn't deserve love. That broke my heart more than anything else. When I told him I was writing this book and explained the societal circumstances that had contributed to his addiction, the stigma against cannabis, and how that led to opioids being the only option presented for pain management, he was able to shed some of that shame. He still had to be accountable for his actions in the present, but he was able to stop blaming himself for his addiction, for taking half of a pill at just 14 years old. A lot of people are in the cannabis industry for financial reasons. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. One of my big goals with this book is to help you make more money. But I also think that we are more fulfilled and successful in business when we have a purpose deeper than money alone. In breaking the stigma against cannabis, we can also break the stigma against addiction. We can stop perpetuating a system that creates addicts and then blames them for their addiction. We can try to save lives in the most literal sense. As cannabis retailers, we also have the opportunity and responsibility to break stigmas around race. The stigma against cannabis has racist roots, and for nearly 100 years, cannabis has been used against people of color as a method to criminalize and incarcerate them. Breaking the stigma against cannabis means educating people that cannabis is not dangerous or bad in most circumstances. We cannot do that without acknowledging that people of color have been wrongly labeled as criminals and disproportionately harmed for selling or simply using cannabis. Now, as more states legalize cannabis, people, who are almost always white, are making millions doing something that got people of color thrown in jail. It's not fair, it's not just, and it's our duty to elevate people of color in the industry. Beyond simply acknowledging these truths, we need to take action to right these wrongs. It's all connected for me: cannabis, addiction, racism. I went to a high school where there was a desegregation policy still in place, where a large percentage of my class were people of color, and many of my friends were black. My white friends and I were called Wiggers, the derogatory term for white people who crossed racial friendship lines and embraced black culture. As a poor kid growing up in a bad neighborhood, it was far easier to relate to black people than many of my white peers. I feel a little uncomfortable writing this because if you look at me today, you would see a privileged white woman, and I don't want to equate my struggles with those of people of color. At the same time, I want to acknowledge how important and impactful black culture, particularly black music, was on me as a child, whose family life was shaped by addiction. When hip-hop artists like Tupac and Bone Thugs-n-Harmony sang of their struggles, of being poor, of living surrounded by violence, of loved ones dying too soon, I was able to hear my own pain. Then when Eminem came on the scene, I felt seen in a way I never had before. Here was a man who had seen the pain of addiction in his family just like me. We were just poor white trailer trash trying to find a way out. Talking about these things matters. It helps us to feel less alone, and with an open conversation and proper education, we can begin breaking all the stigmas: the stigma against cannabis, the stigma against addiction, and the racist stigma against people of color, particularly Black people. These are lofty goals, but we can do it, all while simultaneously building profitable, competitive businesses. The truth is, in securing a cannabis license, you haven't won the lottery. You've won an opportunity. It's the opportunity of a lifetime, but it also comes with responsibilities. So let's become better retailers and break the stigmas.